But my job is to make sure that we can actually have a spirited discussion and a conversation. Angela is going to speak for about 20 minutes as High Representative for Disarmament Affairs at the United Nations. And I'd like to encourage you to use that email address up there, because one of the great ways of making this work as a conversation is that as you hear remarks from Angela, there could be a thought that comes into your mind which you'd like me to pick up, or I'll come to you afterwards during the Q&A session. And it allows me to know the kind of spirit in which you'd like to enter into discussion afterwards before you have your first course. So please, if you have a tablet or a smartphone, do feel you can use that. And if you can't read it at the back, I'm going to read it to you, and you'll find a piece of paper on your table as well. It's EU non-prolif@gmail.com, and I will be able to read everything on my tablet. Don't send me a paper. Don't send me several sides. That's not what it's about. It's about an issue you might want to raise, particularly those further back, so I know who you are and where I might find you. There are 4 microphones here as well. So those are the rules of the road for the next 45 or 50 minutes, or longer if you want, and you want to eat your meal much faster. Let me just give you a personal reflection. I came in this morning from London, and yesterday I was at a conference at the Royal United Services Institute. I've been involved in reporting diplomatic affairs, security affairs, international affairs for quite a long time, over several decades, as my CV will tell you. I think I'd just like to inject at this point that it seems to me there's a major challenge to all the theology of non-proliferation and disarmament, given what is now happening, certainly in 2 areas, in ways which we were not in a position to even predict back in January or February. I don't need to identify exactly what I'm talking about. And with that is the danger and the reality now of proliferation and rearmament going on, including violation of treaties. So it seems to me that while there can be the theology and the great ideas of disarmament and non-proliferation, and I mention what happened at Russie yesterday because there were 2 very senior military figures, including Disarmament from down the road in Mons, warning about just what lies ahead now in terms of the recalibration of public understanding of what the challenges might now be for an alliance of 28 and beyond. Public, which was averse to any action a year ago over Syria and what happened on the 21st of August in the Damascus suburbs, public opinion is beginning to switch. I'm only giving you a private observation that whereas this kind of discussion might have had a certain direction of travel 3, 4, 5 months ago, now the landscape is changing amazingly fast. And therefore, what we're going to hear from Angela, and she's already warned me and alerted me to the one word she's going to use, a swerve. So, Angela, the floor is yours, and please do feel, even if it's only a few of you, if you want to use your smartphone rather than answering your emails and picking up on texts and so on, then please do feel you can use that email address. Angela Kane, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Nick, and I'm very honored that you've agreed to moderate this. I don't want to say the panel. I'm like the sole performer here, so I trust you'll be with me. And I also want to thank Mark, but I think I have to thank Mark with a little bit of a caveat. I told him I really hate to speak during dinner, particularly if I'm not eating or drinking, so I said we have to do this before we start actually dinner. But thank you, Mark, anyway, and I know that you have done a great deal, as all of you in this room, to advance the great causes of disarmament and non-proliferation. And Nick already mentioned the word swerve, but I think I'm not going to speak about the swerve in the direction that he was indicating, but I'm going to talk about a different swerve, and you will hear about it. Now, why did I come by this word of swerve? I must tell you that 2 or 3 weeks ago, I read an interesting commentary in the New York Times by Robert J. Lifton on what he called a swerve of climate change. He borrowed that provocative term from a Harvard humanitarians professor, Stephen Greenblatt, who wrote a book about 2 years ago. And essentially, what it refers to is a major historical change in consciousness. It is a term often linked with a kind of general epiphany leading to a new awareness of something that is really quite profound, something connecting with our basic humanity, something affecting our whole system of values, or something even on a universal or planetary dimension. And as most of you know, I'm a citizen of Germany, a country that gave us another intriguing term, Zeitgeist, or the spirit of the age. In this respect, think of a swerve as a fundamental shift in the consciousness of a great mass of humanity toward a new zeitgeist, a new spirit of our age today, or the spirit of an emerging age. Now, fully in accordance with the adage that where one stands depends on where one sits, from my vantage point at the UN's Office for Disarmament Affairs, it appears that we could well be witnessing several of the hallmarks of a swerve, or at least some of it harboring us, in the field of disarmament. Similar trends may also be underway in the related fields of arms control, non-proliferation, nuclear security, and counterterrorism. Evidence for this is found in mounting frustrations with current approaches to address these great goals, combined with a persisting impatience with the status quo and a growing determination to explore alternatives. Alternatives that are both more effective in achieving these goals and that are more legitimate, fair, and ethical in the eyes of world opinion. To this distinguished audience of researchers and representatives of governments and NGOs, I scarcely need to elaborate on the existence of the evidence of my first dossier of evidence and those dealing with the frustrations. The lack of nuclear disarmament is perhaps most frustrating to the vast majority of UN member states as well as the states parties to the NPT. A cursory examination of the statements at the General Assembly's First Committee provides ample evidence of this, and more evidence will appear when the First Committee meets again next month for its 69th session. These frustrations are not just due to the lack of disarmament negotiations, but also to the existence of long-term programs to modernize existing nuclear arsenals. What I find most noteworthy about this dismal track record are the responses by the world community and civil society. The world has simply refused to accept failure as the inevitable fate of disarmament. We already have throughout the world today a deep appreciation that any future use of a nuclear weapon would be catastrophic. Scholars have referred to this as the nuclear taboo. Even die-hard advocates of nuclear deterrence agree the intent is not to actually use these weapons, which would of course be a calamity of limitless dimension, but to prevent their use through the credible threat of an unacceptable counterstrike. It is precisely this virtually universal consensus that nuclear weapons absolutely must not be used, which has inspired the humanitarian approach to disarmament, an approach that is increasingly challenging the status quo policies and approaches that are focused just on preserving existing arsenals or merely reducing risk of use. There's a growing awareness today of the fragility of deterrence, the extent that it depends on good luck, the risk of nuclear accidents, the inherent instability of deterrence in a world of many nuclear-armed states, and the unacceptability of any use whatsoever of nuclear weapons, whether in the form of a strike or in retaliation. And there is a growing understanding throughout the world that any use of nuclear weapons would be contrary to international humanitarian and human rights law, customary international law, and universal principles of morality. So we still have roughly 16,000 or thereabouts nuclear weapons in our imperfect world. We are also seeing the early signs of a swerve toward an alternative vision of the future of such weapons, a future in which such weapons do not exist at all, rather than one in which they are just less likely to be used. This is an interesting idea well worth considering on the eve of preparations to commemorate this year's International Day for the Total Elimination of Nuclear Weapons, which you know will be held on 26 September. Thus far, I've limited my remarks to nuclear disarmament, but the same logic also applies to nuclear non-proliferation. If we are indeed witnessing the emergence of a swerve toward nuclear disarmament, is it any surprise that we would not also be facing the prospect of significant improvements in the field of non-proliferation? Indeed, in posing this question, I'm pointing here to the most important factor that gives non-proliferation legitimacy in the family of nations. Namely, it is an activity that seeks to prevent the spread or the acquisition of weapons, not just by specific countries because they're untrustworthy, but because of the intrinsic nature of the weapons themselves. Nuclear non-proliferation is legitimate because of the fundamental illegitimacy of nuclear weapons. They cannot be legitimate here, but not legitimate there. In the words of Secretary General Ban Ki-moon, and I quote, "There are no right hands for wrong weapons," unquote. Right now, preparations are underway for the 2015 NPT Review Conference, an event that will give its states parties an opportunity not just to criticize the lack of progress in nuclear disarmament. The conference will also provide a forum for re-establishing some balance in the disarmament and non-proliferation commitments under the treaty. For many states, this will involve an approach to nuclear disarmament emphasizing the unacceptability of nuclear weapons under humanitarian law, given their indiscriminate and catastrophic effects. In two earlier review conferences, the states parties have already affirmed that disarmament offers the only absolute guarantee against the use of such weapons. The idea that somehow non-proliferation controls will be significantly improved at that event in lieu of any progress in disarmament is, frankly, in my opinion, a fantasy. These issues are closely intertwined, and any attempts to separate them into sequential processes whereby non-proliferation must first be achieved before disarmament is possible will, again, in my opinion, never command a consensus. All the things that advocates of nuclear non-proliferation truly want, a fissile material treaty, entry into force of the CTBT, universal implementation of the IAEA's additional protocol, enhanced security assurances, and de-alerting, all will be much easier to achieve politically in the climate of a world moving to eliminate nuclear weapons. Surely, this is more likely to be true than would be the case of an alternative world in which some states are clinging to their existing stockpiles and are zealously modernizing them. Though nuclear weapons are not the only weapons of mass destruction, much of what I've said today also applies to both chemical and biological weapons. The Chemical Weapons Convention today, as we have heard, has 190 states parties, almost as many as the UN Charter. The decisions last year by the Syrian Arab Republic to become a party and eliminate its chemical arsenal was widely welcomed. This was not just because the country involved was Syria and because chemical weapons were used in the Syrian conflict. It was also because the possession and use of such weapons anywhere is universally viewed as unacceptable. The specific taboo against possession of chemical weapons is easily seen in the absence of any state or any country putting themselves forward as a chemical weapons state. And the same applies to biological weapons. Which countries have defined themselves as biological weapon states? Which countries are threatening to unleash the plague if attacked by smallpox? Which countries are employing anthrax and tularemia in the name of deterrence or sharing them with allies? We see here that the global swerve against biological and chemical weapons has virtually, but not quite yet, given us a world free of such weapons. A world based on the universal perception that such weapons are illegitimate. With respect to chemical weapons, we have reinforced this taboo with verification. In the case of biological weapons, the reinforcement has come in the form of improvements in transparency, work at annual meeting of experts, a periodic review conference, export controls, and continuing efforts to achieve fully universal membership in and compliance with the Biological and Toxic Weapon Convention. Although I've been discussing and illustrating the concept of a swerve, I think it's also useful to recognize that several swerves can coexist at any particular time. The UN, for example, has been working to achieve two parallel goals since 1946. the elimination of nuclear weapons and all weapons adaptable to mass destruction, and the limitation, reduction, and regulation of conventional arms. We have seen some powerful swerves in the area of WMD, but to some extent, we're also starting to see the emergence of a new swerve in the conventional arms field. We already have a multilateral treaty outlawing or limiting certain conventional weapons that are unusually repugnant due to their uniquely inhumane effects. A treaty outlawing anti-personnel landmines and a treaty outlawing cluster munitions. True, these treaties do not have universal membership. True, key possessors are still not states parties. Yet the trends are in the right direction, as these weapons are increasingly viewed throughout the world as intrinsically unacceptable. And after decades of discussion, the Arms Trade Treaty was finally concluded last year, and its entry into force is almost certainly just months away. The conventional arms swerve has extended to collective action against the illicit trade in small arms and light weapons. While the 2001 Program of Action against that trade has not yet developed into a legally binding treaty, it has nevertheless been important in the evolution of global norms against that illicit trade and in providing a focus for specific government actions to strengthen that norm. The biennial meeting of participants in the Program of Action provide an arena for states to compare their experiences, share lessons learned, and explore new ways of advancing its goals. Alas, the technology of weaponry is anything but static. New weapons are emerging all the time. Scarcely a day goes by without new references to cyber weapons, lethal autonomous weapons, and countless other diabolical inventions designed to kill or injure. Many of these weapons raise profound questions of accountability, especially given that their victims would largely be civilians. We have a variety of expert groups as well as national governments looking into these weapons to explore possibilities of developing new norms governing their use or their prohibition. I know this is an activity now underway in many of the groups represented in this room today. Additional initiatives are being pursued at the regional level, thereby illustrating what might be called a regional swerve. In the case of regional nuclear weapon-free zones, this swerve is in full force, as we already have 5 such zones. Efforts are continuing to convene a conference on the establishment of a Middle East zone free of nuclear weapons and all other weapons of mass destruction, effort that, while admittedly falling somewhat short of a swerve, are most definitely here to stay. As mandated by the 2010 NPT Review Conference, the Secretary General and the 3 co-sponsors of the NPT's 1995 resolution on the Middle East, and you know that Russian Federation, UK, and the US, will in the near future continue their consultations with states of the region to convene such a conference. Personally, I do believe that the conference will be held very soon, though I cannot predict exactly when. Other regional initiatives are underway under consideration in Northeast Asia, including various options for establishing a regional nuclear weapon-free zone. In South Asia, there have already been some bilateral initiatives in the area of confidence-building measures, though the region has certainly swerved away from previous initiatives to establish a nuclear weapon-free zone. Yet the risks, uncertainties, instabilities, and the costs of the regional nuclear arms and missile races now underway on the subcontinent are all factors that will someday stand a reasonable chance of stimulating a new push from civil society and certain sectors of government for new controls over such weaponry. One of the ways that a swerve gets started is through the growth of a widely shared perception that a better world is possible by means of alternative policies, policies that actually do enhance rather than erode security interests. My tour d'horizon will come to an end with a tribute to groups in civil society, including the full membership of the EU Non-Proliferation Consortium, who not only understand the meaning of a swerve, but are active contributors in causing a swerve to exist and to grow in intensity. You are, of course, not alone, as countless other groups in civil society also have their own contributions to make. The future of a swerve will not be determined by theorists, but by our fellow practitioners, people who believe in persistent advocacy for great common ends. This includes people who work in governments, diplomats, public officials, and political leaders. The future of these various swerves will not be driven by some hidden hand of history, but by dedicated, hard work by individuals and groups sharing common goals. It will not be driven solely by initiatives from the bottom up that originate in civil society. It will not be driven solely by national diplomatic initiatives or collective efforts by coalitions of states from the outside in. It will not be driven solely by enlightened leadership from the top down by leaders of states with the most dangerous weapons. It will instead more likely require sustained action on all three levels. Here is where we will find the dynamics of the swerve. It is what enables work to occur and for progress to be achieved. I look forward to seeing what the EU consortium has in store for contributing to this process. I'm sure I will not be disappointed. Even the sky is not the limit in what you can help to accomplish, for I've not even mentioned today the issues of weapons in space. Whether here at home or in the heavens, there is a place for a swerve. The future of humanity and our planet depend on them far more than we all recognize. So let us get on with the work of contributing to them while insisting that they head in the direction of serving the collective interest. Let's start today. May the swerve be with us. Thank you.
Angela, thank you very much indeed. I've already got a lot of messages from you, but don't let that stop because it'll allow me to get through an awful lot of areas in the next half hour. How many people out there would like to have a question or raise an issue? I can see one down here at the back, 3 or 4, 5. Then I can time it. So, Angela, you can get an idea of the kind of way we'd like to pace this over the next half hour. But look, can I just pick up that point right at the beginning, which I made, taking the liberty of reflecting not least what's happening in South Wales at the moment, but that really much of what you've said, that the principles are really under severe challenge now. And that while you're talking about swerves, there could now be counter-swerves, which could lead to much more than something much worse than what I'm loosely calling a car crash, even on conventional weapons. And when I just quote to you what Disarmament said on the record yesterday, NATO has got to refresh its capability to deter Russia up to strategic nuclear weapons. Now, that's not helpful when at the same time there's a mood of moving towards non-proliferation and disarmament.
I think that you're right. The swerve doesn't only go in one direction. Now, working for the United Nations, I'm the eternal optimist, so I would like to see the swerve that clearly started before the Ukraine
But you have
events.
to be a pragmatist in the current environment.
You have to be a pragmatist, but on the other hand, I don't think that there is an appetite for even more arms races. We've seen a lot of it already. It's extremely costly, and while there was a lot of talk about, well, for example, the Russian Federation would never have done what they did by invading Crimea and basically taking it over had Ukraine kept nuclear weapons. I don't think that that is a very good argument, and I really don't want to see that persist or even bringing it up. And I think that what will happen, that unless there is the swerve in the right direction, i.e. when we stay with nuclear, to disarm, I think that will only encourage more countries to say, fine, if that is not happening, if that is what is needed in order for me to be protected, so to say, then yes, I will also seek to acquire increasingly sophisticated weapons, if not nuclear weapons.
But let me put to you, I mean, theologically, you can still aspire to the same kind of ambitions, but in your office, are you actively saying to yourselves, look, we have to reassess what is now achievable given the new realities and the new precedents that are being set, not in months or years, but actually days and weeks at the moment?
But you always do that. I mean, I just remember that President Obama came into office with a great vision of actually reducing nuclear weapons in conjunction with the Russian Federation. And that did not happen. And I think that did not happen because the climate was so poor for a length of time. Then you had the Syria agreement between the Russian Federation and the United States. So then we all thought that, well, a new era has dawned, and so therefore it is possible, because of these bilateral relations, that actually you can move forward, also nuclear proliferation. That didn't happen, despite the climate improving. So now you have to assess all the time, but you can never, in my opinion, lose sight of the goal. I'm not going to basically roll back my goal and say we will not have nuclear disarmament simply because the time is not right for it. That does not mean that you give up fighting for it, because if you lose sight of the goal, you'll never get there.
All right, look, let me pick up some of the points which are being raised, which sort of begin to move in clusters around some of the issues you've raised there, Angela. Camille Grand, and you mentioned the EU consortium. What are the consequences of the collapse of the Budapest memorandum for the global non-proliferation regime?
It was very interesting. Let me go back to what happened. The Ukrainian ambassador wanted to have an event at the United Nations, and he wanted to have this during the NPT preparatory committee that took place in April, to commemorate the 10th anniversary of Ukraine joining the NPT as a non-nuclear power. And he asked me to co-sponsor it, and I said, yes, I would do that. And it was a very interesting event. I mean, some of you in the room were here. I'm looking at Jacek, he was there, for example. It was a very interesting event because what happened also is that the point was made that this was not a legal treaty. It was a Budapest memorandum. It was not a legal treaty. That, I think, was a revelation to many people who were in the room. But it was a very muted, event. I mean, there were some statements. I mean, the guarantors made statements, etc. But on the other hand, it did not have a protest movement that started in terms of saying, what can we actually do? It fell pretty flat. And you don't read very much right now about the Budapest Memorandum. Right or wrong, I'm not passing judgment on it. But on the other hand, it was not enforceable. That's basically the message that was passed.
What signal, though, does that send if it was not enforceable?
A very poor signal, because basically what it means is that if there is a guarantee of non-violation of the borders, if there's a degree of no first use, then of course a member state who has entered into an agreement, meaning the recipient of such a guarantee, what does it mean for that member state? I can't tell you, you have to go to the member states, but it is not a good signal, I agree.
There are a lot of issues being raised here, and with your agreement, I want to get through as many of them as we can. And so I'm going to summarize and also read a few of them as well as coming to the floor. A view on deterrence and proliferation here from Ambassador Tariq Osman Haider from Pakistan, a member of the Oversight Board for Strategic Export Controls. He appreciated your speech, but nuclear powers hold that they have a right to keep for them for reasons of deterrence. Of them, while two of the non-NPT countries in South Asia and China support the Nuclear Weapons Convention to ban production and right to keep nuclear weapons, which trumps the FMCT, the Western nuclear powers are against even starting negotiations on such a convention.
I think this is something that has to be sorted out in the international community. I do think there's definitely a problem with 4 member states or 4 states that have nuclear power, that have nuclear weapons, and that are not part of a regime that is a verification regime, and that basically there is this drive to have a nuclear convention. But on the other hand, you have to have the states who are contributing and willing to engage in such negotiations. Otherwise, you can advocate as much as you want, and you're not going to get there.
So what's your audit? Because Ambassador Haider asks, have you had any success on behalf of the UN, whose point person you are on this issue, that you are in persuading them to change their viewpoint?
No, we haven't. That doesn't mean that I'm not going to give up, that I'm not going to give up trying, but we haven't.
Can you see a way through?
Under the current climate, very, very difficult.
Impossible?
No, never. Never. That does not exist in my vocabulary. The word impossible does not exist.
All right. Let me pick up Professor Dr. Plamen Pantev from Sofia University. What are the official nuclear powers to be blamed for the ongoing proliferation issues? Picking up again on that last point from Pakistan. To be blamed for the ongoing proliferation problems.
I think basically what I see is over the last couple of years, and that really started with the Nuclear Security Summit, that there's more shift or swerve, if you so want, by the nuclear weapon states to focus on non-proliferation, to basically to prevent nuclear material or nuclear weapons, even that, falling into the hands of terrorists. And I think that distracts a little bit from the overall debate that is going on. And I find that it is a good effort to make sure that it does not happen. And so we should all support that effort, and we certainly do. I mean, I certainly do. But on the other hand, that does not solve the underlying issue of who has nuclear weapons and who doesn't. And so that is basically where you have to come to an agreement of how do you move forward. But only non-proliferation is not the answer.
Just picking up on the Budapest Convention, Henk van der Kwast has just picked up on you saying and asking what is the effect of the violation of the Budapest memo for the relation between NWS and NNWS for the NPT?
Well, frankly, as I mentioned, this happened prior to the NPT preparatory committee meeting. It happened, in April was the meeting, and I was amazed how little talk there was about it. And I was amazed how little this event, which was clearly built as an event, which was bound to be discussing the Budapest Memorandum, was attended. That I found quite telling, actually.
A question here from Peter Savchak from OPCW, picking up again on what you said about deterrence, that vicious circle, as he puts it, in which many countries advocate disarmament but rely on extended deterrence in alliance arrangements. How do we, quote, swerve against arguments in favor of nuclear weapons based on deterrence and extended deterrence? And I've just quoted to you the way NATO is already thinking up the road in Mons.
Well, but NATO also took a decision in Chicago that nuclear weapons would always be part of the alliance. You didn't really hear much of an outcry about that other than the, quote, disarmament community. But on the other hand, that was a very strong affirmation of, nuclear weapons are going to be part of our security profile. But on the other hand, I don't, sorry, I forgot the, what was the last point?
About Budapest, how do we swerve against arguments in favor of nuclear weapons based on deterrence and extended deterrence?
No, what actually, no, you asked actually something else. You asked about the nuclear umbrella, about many member states, right? Because I think that is also an issue that comes up, and you mentioned that. And what I find interesting is that I had a big debate at one point, is like how many people, percentage-wise, of the world's population are under nuclear umbrella. And I, guessed it was somewhere about 40%. It's actually 53%. And I found that was an absolutely amazing statistic. But that makes the position of those member states that are under nuclear umbrella or protection a little bit more difficult in terms of saying exactly, well, we are in favor of X, Y, Z, or we are in favor of nuclear disarmament. So there has to be a little bit of a nuance there because you can't have it both ways.
Right, Angela, for the last 15 minutes, I'm not going to choose where the microphones go. There are 4 microphones, I hope, in this room. Put up your hand and try and persuade a microphone to you so that then I don't get blamed for not pointing the microphone in the right direction. So microphones, please move in to where you find a hand, and I'll come to those people in a moment. I should say that Tom Countryman, the Assistant Secretary of State for Non-Proliferation, has just said that he's pleased, of course, to hear no disagreement with US non-proliferation disarmament policies in your remarks.
I knew you were going to be here, so.
Patricia Lewis from Chatham House. Are the nuclear weapon states doing the risk and response analyses to nuclear weapons use? Those governments working on the humanitarian impacts of nuclear weapons initiative have been taking this very seriously. Isn't it time the nuclear powers joined in? There's a direction of travel to all these questions.
I think that this whole issue of the humanitarian consequences of nuclear war has been very difficult as far as the nuclear powers are concerned, or let's say as far as the P5 nuclear powers are concerned. And as has been demonstrated in these meetings, and these meetings have really been extremely well attended. I mean, you had the first one, which was attended by about 118 member states. The second one, which was held just earlier this year in February, was attended by 142 member states. That's a sizable membership. It's 75% of the membership of the UN. But what it has also done is has focused on the fact that you cannot really deal with an outbreak or an explosion of a nuclear bomb if it is limited, like in Hiroshima and Nagasaki, if it's a larger one. But it is also shown and demonstrated, and I think Chatham House and has done a presentation on this, is the near accidents that have happened. I mean, they didn't happen. Let's say the near accidents, I don't know, that were prevented, are really quite scary because it was prevented not because they were preventable, but because of a stroke of luck or something. And I think that when you watch that and you see that, it's really quite scary when you realize that it could have happened very easily, that you had actually a nuclear explosion. That would have been absolutely tremendously strong impact and devastated large scale. And I also think that, let me go to another direction. You know, you don't hear very often about nuclear testing. Nuclear testing, I mean, not universal membership in the CTBT, but on the other hand, nuclear testing not, except for DPRK. But if you think of the vast stretches of soil, land, huge, that is contaminated by nuclear testing, by nuclear explosions, and also that will continue to be contaminated for, I don't know, thousands of years, it is quite amazing. And people don't talk about this, but a conference like this will point to this and actually bring it up in the public consciousness. And this is where I see that a change in the consciousness is actually happening among the participants, but you also see it coming up a lot more in the literature, in how it's being covered.
Right, empowerment from the floor. Who's got the microphones? Please, you've got a microphone here, but I'm going to go to the back to prove that I haven't lost sight of people. Anyone at the back who's got the microphone, please. There were some hands which went up, so I don't want you to say I didn't see you because you were sitting in the dark. Anyone there? No, okay, well look, I will come to the front then, please, go ahead.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Angela, for that really inspiring speech.
Because Tarek, you already tabled what the question is about.
That's what I'm going to ask.
Okay.
So
I was going to come to you at the end in that. That's why I'm hoping that I can come to you in a moment.
Okay, so if you're going to come to that, then I'll withdraw now.
All right. He wants to ask where Ban Ki-moon hopes things will be. You have notice of that question at the end of his term. Please, a microphone here at the front. There must be someone at the back. Please don't tell me that I didn't recognize you. There were several hands which did go up.
Thank you very much. Alan Ware from Parliamentarians for Nuclear Non-Proliferation and Disarmament. Angela, you mentioned the statistic of 53% of the population under countries that are under nuclear deterrence doctrines. If you look at the other statistic, it's the majority of countries do not rely on nuclear weapons for deterrence. I'm from one of those countries. I'm wondering, and there are many countries that used to be under nuclear deterrence or even had nuclear weapons that have given up and have found security without nuclear weapons. What role do you think the UN has to play in highlighting security without nuclear weapons? Both the positive stories of how countries have found security without nuclear weapons and the positive role that the UN can play to assist in resolving the conflicts that give rise, or the issues that give rise to nuclear weapons.
You know, this is a very interesting question. I'm reminded this morning in the plenary on Iran, I think it was Nabila who mentioned something about the prestige that is still attached to nuclear weapons. And, you know, why do countries really feel that they have a lot more prestige? And sometimes we get this question also. And what happens is that, you know, I always sort of say, well, is South Africa a less powerful country because it gave up nuclear weapons? Is Kazakhstan a less powerful country because it gave up? Is Brazil a less powerful country because they gave up nuclear weapons? I frankly, in my opinion, that is not the case. And I think that when you look at Latin America and the Caribbean, that's the only huge block where you have no nuclear weapons. I mean, you don't even have a state under nuclear protection. And I think that that was a trailblazer, but it was a trailblazer because there was a consensus, and I think it was Rogelio who was talking about his involvement between Argentina and Brazil, precisely about the nuclear weapons. Argentina is a case in point as well. So I think those are powerful examples, but people don't talk about this, and they should be talking a lot more about it, because I don't think that this prestige issue has been terribly overblown. It really has, because on the one hand you say you'll never use it, but on the other hand it's being given prestige, and that's why I made the point. No one will say I'm a biological weapons country or I'm a chemical weapons country. It doesn't portray the same prestige. And I had last year, when I was in charge of this chemical weapons investigation in Syria, you know, I sort of said to the people I discussed it with, and I said, I don't understand. I said, everyone is outraged about a chemical weapons use. I said, what would happen if we actually had, accidental or otherwise, a nuclear weapons use? Everyone is outraged, but the same outrage does not carry over to nuclear weapons. There is still, as was mentioned, the prestige factor attached to it.
Let me just pick up. There is a lot of expertise here in the room, but as you just mentioned, Syria and what happened on the 21st of August and what happened amazingly in those literally few days after that, and now it's been confirmed that all the CW has been destroyed. What is your reflection on the process which amazingly politically led to that pressure which then led to the Syrian decision to do that. What have we learned about the willingness of those in political leadership to take that kind of decision? Was it pressure or was it something else?
I think that there was so much outrage, and I think that the other thing that was extremely strongly contributing to that outreach was Twitter, YouTube, the pictures that you actually saw. We don't see pictures on a consistent basis of the people who are dying in the conflict. And by that time, the figure of people who had died in the Syrian conflict was somewhere like 100,000. I mean, it was already huge. And they were like estimated, we never knew, but they were estimated about 1,400 victims of chemical weapons. But those pictures going around the world, us being there at the same time that it happened, negotiating with the government to see that we could get into Ghouta, was absolutely unbelievable. And then us being seen to be investigating it and coming out with a report within a very short time proving that chemical weapons were used was an absolute game changer. And whether that was a swerve, but that led to that action taken by the Russian Federation and the United States. And I must say that what happened was not only that they negotiated the agreement, but they also made it possible and accompanied the process to basically say, we need to eliminate that. And there were bumps in the road. And the other thing is, let's not forget this, it was an extremely expensive venture. I mean, there was a lot of money, there was a lot of contributions by the US, Russian Federation, European countries to eliminate it. Normally, as you know, under the Chemical Weapons Convention, the country itself has to eliminate. Well, Syria didn't pay a cent about this, or let's say, they did not really do this. It's vastly expensive. That was all taken care of and outside of the country.
There may be a lot of horror in this room when I ask what I'm now about to ask. Does it therefore need the use of a nuclear weapon to convince people how awful it is?
You know, Nick, that's exactly what I was debating after this chemical weapons outbreak came. And, that's the question that I would hope it does not. I don't have that answer, but it is a question that is a valid question. After what happened with chemical weapons, what would happen? We had a big discussion about what will happen. Next year is the 70th anniversary of the atomic bomb explosions over Hiroshima and Nagasaki. I was in Hiroshima in August for the 69th commemoration. And there are now talks about what can we do to keep this current. I think that what happened in the 80s when you had a lot of a lot of disarmament, you had, these General Assembly sessions, you had a lot of people, 1 million people in New York in the street to protest against it. That was a different generation. They still remembered, nuclear explosions, the Hiroshima and Nagasaki. This generation doesn't do that anymore. It's too far away. So how can you actually keep that alive? And I think that with the humanitarian consequence of nuclear war, that's precisely what has picked up that issue, that we cannot have another explosion of a nuclear. And so that creates a certain climate and an atmosphere and brings it out in the public consciousness that I think, to my mind, is very positive.
It's a deeply forbidding option. Anyone at the further back who does have the microphone? Yes, please. You have the microphone. Go ahead.
Yes, thank you very much, Richard Guthrie, CBW Events. I think the logic behind what you say about humanitarian consequences of nuclear war is impeccable, but will that really influence the nuclear weapon states? I'm British, but I'm opposed to Britain having nuclear weapons, but the reality is governments take decisions that they see as being in their political and security interest to do so, and I'm not sure how some of these humanitarian issues would necessarily put pressure on those capitals. But the second part I think that I want to ask goes to a deeper question. That is, if a nuclear weapon-free world is going to be effective and to be stable, it's got to be something more than simply the world we have without nuclear weapons. If it's not stable, it won't be sustainable. So is there anything else we have to do other than simply get rid of nuclear weapons in order to have a sustainable nuclear weapons-free world?
Angela.
Yeah, I can't really answer that. I mean, if you have a nuclear weapon, you're never going to use it. I mean, how is the world going to be less stable or more stable? That's an answer that no one has an answer to, because the thing is that we have never tried it. I mean, we tried it, we haven't tried it for 70 years. But when it comes to the humanitarian consequences, you're absolutely right. You cannot force countries to do something they don't want to do. We always talk about political will. But I think there is also a matter of priming this political will, if you so want. And I see the humanitarian consequences as doing precisely that. I think that what would be helpful is if the nuclear weapon states, the P5, because India and Pakistan were there at this conference, if they would in fact engage, how can one best engage? Because you have to engage somehow. An absence is not going to be very helpful. But on the other hand, you cannot sort of stand there, have these conferences, and basically say we're just going to pillory the P5. That doesn't work either. So you have to somehow engage in a dialogue. And I think the dialogue, to my mind, has to start precisely about the inhumaneness of these weapons. I mean, why do we have, cluster munitions? I talked about some of these conventions that exist. And I think that actually, again, is the stigma of not using, not manufacturing against this. And I think the stigma simply right now is not there yet. But I think we have to work for it.
Your ambition is treaties and enshrining agreements in treaties. How much do you fear that the current atmosphere, particularly what's now happening over Ukraine, what we're seeing with conventional forces, what we're beginning to see with violations of the INF Treaty as well, that in its own way is going to devalue and make virtually impossible your aspirations to achieve new treaties?
I think it is very much and has become much more of an uphill struggle. I totally agree with you, Nick. I think that the atmosphere right now is not conducive. I even went back further when President Obama of the US came into power with a Prague speech, which was very empowering, I think, for the whole disarmament community. And again, even though those difficulties didn't exist at the time, it basically takes the Russian Federation to cooperate and to basically go along. I mean, he even made an offer to do it in conjunction with the Russian Federation to basically bring down the numbers. I think that was all very positive. That is pretty much stalled right now. It is not a good atmosphere to have that talk.
It's being violated, isn't it? Not stalled.
Yes, but I mean, the dialogue for nuclear disarmament has been stalled. So yes, I mean, there are agreements that have been violated. So that is very much a concern, and I think we just need to see how is it all going to sort out. But are we just going to sort of sit back and say it's all gloom and doom? No, I don't think so. At least, we don't. You still have to work through some of the issues. Okay. And I think that sitting at the United Nations, where I'm going to hear plenty of this next month during the first committee, will be very interesting. But it will also not be only in one direction, because there is 193 member states, and they have very decisive views on many of these things.
Anyone at the back? Again, I'm coming halfway down. Anyone who's got the microphone, don't please come up to me and afterwards and say, I wanted to ask a question, or I wanted to make a point, or I wanted to disagree with the High Representative. Someone has the microphone there. I can see you with it. Please.
Hi. Thank you. I'm Roberto Dondich, Director General for Global Issues in the Mexican government. And my question, Angela, has to do more with the conventional weapons and the logic in the UN, in which we work very much in commissions or in silos. And sometimes we don't talk to one another. But at this moment, we're negotiating the post-2015 development agenda, which is a framework that would guide development for every country in the world for 15 years. And for the first time, we're seeing an introduction, as we just finished the Sustainable Development Goals agenda, an introduction of a goal on just societies. And it calls for action also on stopping illicit arm flows. So how can this be strengthened in the logic that for development, we need security, we need stability, and in this case, disarmament and arms control go hand in hand?
Yes, I think I did talk about the small arms, and I really am very happy that it did find its way into the post-2015 agenda. I think that those of us who have been around a little bit longer all remember the painful debate about disarmament and development in the 80s, which was basically an effort to sort of say, well, if you disarm, you have more money, and therefore it can go to development, something that was totally rejected, never flew, and it kind of died a quiet death. But on the other hand, I think that what is happening is that the modernization programs, and I think that this is coming up more and more, I think there's big debates in a number of countries, particularly about modernization of nuclear weapons, because it's so extremely costly. So this is something that's coming up more and more. And I'm as I said, I'm very pleased that there was a connection made with small arms. The problem that we have in Africa, and the problem that we have, for example, also in Latin America, primarily in the Caribbean and Central America, why were there so much fighting for the Arms Trade Treaty? Precisely because they were awash in arms that were just coming through their countries. What is happening in Africa? I mean, you have like one country is a bit more, quote, pacified, and we've seen this in the peacekeeping operations, that one country is more pacified, and those arms get smuggled right across the border to the next country, which is actually not pacified, but there's active fighting going on. I mean, you know, Libya, there were huge amounts of arms that went south and southwest. So that was basically something that we're dealing with, and that, I think, has not really been adequately addressed. And I give you just one example. I mean, we made in our office, we made the proposal to the Security Council, which decides on the peacekeeping mandates, to say, fine, we had a pilot project in the Côte d'Ivoire to register a lot of the arms, so at least they could be traced, some of them, so we would know what there was. And we sort of said, put it in the mandate for other peacekeeping operations. You know, it's like a 3-4 person operation. It's very cheap. And they said, well, you know, this is going to be very difficult, etc. Still working on it. But that's exactly what we need to focus on, because people don't die at now with nuclear weapons, but they do die every day in large numbers because of conventional arms.
Angela, my seismic sensing and verification devices up here tell me that some people are getting rather hungry. But therefore, I'm about to go to 2 more and last questions. First, Mark Fitzpatrick, building on this issue of the swerve and nuclear sword rattling, as you're putting it, Mark.
Angela, you're my hero. Not just the content of your presentation, but your willingness to go with the flow. I have a little concern that I didn't fully brief you on how this evening was going to go. But you're a great sport.
Have I violated a treaty then, Mark?
My question was that given the nuclear sword rattling that we've been hearing from Moscow recently, do you get the sense that your message just isn't getting through to where it needs to be heard the most? That maybe swerve doesn't translate well into Russian?
Would you prefer a U-turn? Would you prefer a U-turn, a handbrake turn, rather than a swerve?
I don't care what you call it, as long as it goes in the right direction, Nick. So I think that's my answer. I think that it's been very difficult with the Russian Federation, with our Russian colleagues. And I sense, to my mind, the way that I see this in the international community, and believe you, it's a private impression, but there's an increasing isolation there. And I think that is not very healthy. And I think it really would be much better on our side, international community, other states, I don't care what you call it, to have more engagement. We saw that also with the Arms Trade Treaty. The Arms Trade Treaty is not supported by the Russian Federation. And yet, you know, what we would like to see is we would like to see the major arms exporters particularly being part of this, because that's the whole point. So I think that what we need to do is we need to do a lot more engagement, and we need to talk to a much broader swath of people than we've actually done right now. It seems to be a smallish community, if I can call it that we deal with in the United Nations from the Russian Federation. That is not good. And so that's basically where I see other member states in general, particularly the ones that can make some changes, I really have an influence. And I'm including EU, or, I'm not saying individual member states, but groupings, regional groupings as well.
But Mark's saying specifically that the Russian Federation is not understanding this.
I don't know what you want me to say to that, but
well, you've just nodded. Okay, it's an on-the-record nod. Finally, Tariq Ralph, you wanted to pick up on WMD in the Middle East.
A few years ago, the Secretary General had his 5-point plan, which he then reiterated. But now there's the lack of a perception of a global champion for nuclear disarmament and on the Middle East as well. So do you think now that the Secretary General is in his second and final term, he could be more outspoken and take a much higher profile on this issue and show the leadership and become a global champion, because we really need champions. The Landmines Treaty came about because there was a champion, and there seems to be a vacuum. President Obama was a champion at one point, but he's gone quiet, and he's now saddled with many problems. So what role do you see for your office, for the Secretary General, and can he launch also a high-level initiative on the Middle East and a nuclear weapons-free world?
Your question is very much pushing this idea of what you call a high-level initiative to bring the feuding states, as he's written here, to the table.
You know, I think that is a very good concept. I can't tell you that it's going to happen. I think when you talk about the 5-point plan that the Secretary put forward, I think it was 2008, Sergio, were you there? I think 5.8? 2009. 2009. You know, basically it's fallen, it has been picked up by a number of member states, particularly the non-aligned, have mentioned it, they have proposed it, they talk about the convention, you know, particularly as a desirable goal, but it's not really found a lot of support, let's put it that way. I have mentioned it because I really do think that the 5-point plan was a good one, but on the other hand, I just don't think it got any traction. And when you talk about someone who is a champion for this, you know, it is more than just putting one idea forward. I think if you want to be a champion, you really have to fight for something. And that means you have to engage all the time. And that means you have to push it and nudge and talk. And frankly, knowing the Secretary General, he doesn't have that focus on one issue. He has to focus on so many issues, and particularly, you know, lately, when you've had so many crises exploding, that is not possible for someone like him. If you have a champion, yes, absolutely. But on the other hand, it has to be the sustained attention and single-mindedness of a champion to actually get something done. Because you have to, you know, rattle the cage and get member states and others to agree to what you want to do. Very, very difficult. But yes, if you can identify some champions and propose, we'll work on them.
And Angela, even though it's just come in a thought from Jacek Bielica, our Special Envoy for Non-Proliferation and Disarmament at the WEAS, as a lesson learned from the breach of the Budapest Memorandum, do you think that the UN Security Council could potentially play a role in guaranteeing security of a non-P5 nuclear weapon state which would give up nuclear weapons?
I think that's a great idea. I wonder what they would say to that. You know, the Security Council it's very interesting. I've been at the UN for a long time, so I've followed the Security Council for umpteen years. And 20 years ago, 25 years ago, you couldn't even breathe the word human rights in Security Council. You couldn't breathe the word, you know, humanitarian help in the Security Council. These days, they talk about all and sundry. They do not talk about nuclear security. I had a very hard time, and I finally convinced them to talk about small arms. We had last year, and actually it was under Argentina, there you are, Roberto, under Argentina's leadership in the Security Council, we had the first ever resolution on small arms. The first ever resolution on small arms. They are reluctant to take up that issue because of the P5, particularly on the nuclear weapon side. There was a resolution that was passed about 2 years ago, I think it was, when India and Pakistan were both members of the council. I think it's a really good idea. I wish there was a member state of the council, or that somehow that could be discussed. I think it's a bit utopian at this point, but why not try it? Why not talk about it? Why not bring it up? Just like when we talked about the small arms, at first there was not much appetite for it, and then it happened. So I think that is a step up with the nuclear issue, but on the other hand, I would say why not?
Angela, thank you very much indeed. You could almost heard a pin drop at various times during your remarks this evening, which have gone on for an hour, which is much longer than we expected. So unless anyone is desperate to hold back dinner even further and would like to raise their hand, I don't want, again, to be accosted and told you didn't come to me. Even if you're sitting behind a pillar and can't see me, I will take a thought from you, but I think we've drawn, there is one, and she's not hiding behind a pillar, please, because I think...
Thank you.
One last question.
Thank you, Angela. If it is not Obama and it is not Ban Ki-moon, who would lead in these disarmament issues? Who could be a mentor? Where is the leadership in this world? Angela, I'm asking you because I think we really lack leadership in this world, in the European continent, in the EU, in the New World, whatever, in the Middle East, my own region. You know, where can we find this person, you know?
Well,
is it the international, I'm not finished, thank you. Where, is it the international community? How can the international community get together? Who could harness it? Is there a Sam Nunn to get this together? I don't think that he has the energy. Thank you.
Maybe your next role at the UN in your career could be High Representative for Leadership.
Let me just make one remark. I can't resist this because, you know, you all know the work that we do and you know how hard we struggle. And what I find absolutely amazing, and I thank all of those states who have supported us with voluntary contributions, we have 0.3% of the regular budget of the UN. Our budget is smaller than the cleaning budget for the Secretariat building in New York. which is a really depressing statistic. So all of the expectations that you put in us is centered on very few people.
Angela, thank you very much indeed. That's a tremendous clarification, both of the cleaning budget at the UN and its relationship to your office, but also the equally challenging issues of non-proliferation in a world which has got a whole lot more complex and worrying, I think, not in years and decades, but actually in weeks and days. So thank you very much indeed, and I'm sure I reflect the gratitude of everyone here who wants to now have dinner. Thank you very much.
And thank you for moderating.